areas where people aren't suffering so much um, is going to cause a lot of conflict and a lot of suffering. And some people think it's going to cause the end of civilization. There's a whole new academic field called adaptology, which concerns how human beings will adapt to the collapse of civilization. But anyway, the simple answer is that, Buddhism is concerned above all with the elimination of suffering. And the Buddhists had it's our extremely exaggerated sense of being separate from other people in our environment that leads to all the attitudes that cause suffering. Um, so unless we can change the prevailing attitude of separation, we're not going to be able to stop environmental degradation, much less regenerate the planet. I have to keep hitting that then. So, in a nutshell, why is Buddhism relevant to climate change? I think there are three broad areas. I'm going to go into them briefly, and then I'm going to come back to the first one, and that's that Buddhism counters mistaken views, that it models ethical behavior, and that it promotes social resilience. I'm putting up here a picture of Bhikkhu Bodhi, an American born and bred in Brooklyn, who decades ago became a Buddhist monk and who's founded a Buddhist entity called Buddhist Global Relief, which is an example of the way that Buddhists have worked on climate change issues. So by countering mistaken views, I just mean that Buddhism provides a critique of our normal way of perceiving ourselves and the world around us. So as I said before, Buddhism asserts that all things are interdependent, that nothing anywhere exists without causes and conditions, and that if you look deeply into those causes and conditions, it's going to connect you and me to everything that happens in the entire cosmos. So if there are religious or secular views that encourage us to deny interdependence, they've got to be mistaken and they've got to be refuted. Buddhism has many sets of reasonings to use for this analysis. This is a picture of Nagarjuna, who earned the title Second Buddha for his erudition when he wrote 2,000 years ago. But don't want to go into all of those right now. Just want to say that there are many sets of reasonings. A second broad area is that Buddhism models ethical behavior. So, Buddhists take on 5 training precepts, and we all know what they are. I won't go through those, but each of those could be consequential with regard to the climate crisis, but especially the first, not harming others. So from the very beginning, followers of the Buddha were enjoined to handle physical pain or emotional suffering without, rather, they should take precautions to avoid anything that might obviously cause others harm, such as occupations such as hunting or fishing or dealing in weapons. It's recognized that you can't avoid hurting other creatures. For instance, if you're a farmer and you have to plow your field, and of course, a society has to have a police force and a military force to defend the society. But not harming would mean discouragement of human encroachment on wildlife habitats, the pollution of the land, the sea, and the air, and the human cultivation of animals in order to eat their flesh. And then the third broad area is that Buddhism promotes social resilience. So Buddhism has ways of dealing with troubling emotions, such as the anxiety, shame, and grief associated with climate change. It has a broad range of contemplative practices that go beyond emotions to the concepts we have about ourselves and nature. And Buddhists both in Asia and the West are practicing engaged Buddhism, with a capital E, let's say, to influence corporations and government policymakers. The picture shows a monk doing a so-called tree ordination because he knows that loggers will be unwilling to cut down trees that are dressed as monks. So to go back to the topic of countering mistaken views, I just wanted to preface this by noting that Buddhists don't just assert that their doctrines are superior to those of other religions and then ask you to have faith in those doctrines. Nagarjuna, we talked about before, said 2,000 years ago that Buddhism doesn't have doctrines. Each of us has to determine what to believe. So he follows the Buddha who said, just as a goldsmith tests his gold by burning, cutting, and rubbing it, so you must examine my words and accept them, but not merely out of reverence. I think the Buddhist commitment to reasoning is very deep. I was trained in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition of Tsongkhapa, and he repeatedly said that unless we identify our own misconceptions and uproot them with analysis, they will persist. Other Buddhist traditions don't place so much emphasis on reasoning. They say that mindfulness of the present moment, bare attention, will cause spontaneous understanding. But I would note that even in the Theravada and Zen traditions, masters do give Dharma talks and engage in reasoning. And it's because of its commitment to reasoning that Buddhism is compatible with science, I think. Buddhism can't reject anything that's established empirically. So the Dalai Lama says on numerous occasions that if science can demonstrate that a Buddhist belief is not factual, Buddhists should drop it. So the ancient view that the sun and moon and planets revolve around the earth has been jettisoned. Of course, the belief in karma and rebirth cannot be empirically denied, so they really aren't in such danger. So anyway, now going on to talking about dependent arising and the reasoning that goes along with that. I don't think there's any better place to start than with Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese Zen master, because he addresses the attitude of denying interdependence simply and beautifully. So you probably are familiar with this, but I think it bears repeating. If you are a poet, you will see clearly that there is a cloud floating in this sheet of paper. Without a cloud, there will be no rain. Without rain, the trees cannot grow. And without trees, we cannot make paper. If we look into this sheet of paper even more deeply, we can see the sunshine in it. And if we continue to look, we can see the logger who cut the tree and the wheat that became his bread. The logger's father and mother are in it too. Looking even more deeply, we can see ourselves in this sheet of paper. When we look at a sheet of paper, it is part of our perception. Your mind is in here, and mine is also. So we can say that everything is in here with this sheet of paper. We cannot point out one thing that is not in this sheet of paper. Time, space, the rain, the minerals in the soil, the sunshine in the cloud. So he invented his own term for interdependence, namely interbeing. As he liked to say, to be is to interbe. Now, to finish the quote, suppose we try to return one of the elements to its source. Suppose we return the sunshine to the sun. Do you think that this sheet of paper will be possible? No, without this sheet of paper, nothing can be. Without sunshine, nothing can be. And if we return the logger to his mother, then we have no sheet of paper either. The fact is that this sheet of paper is made up only of non-paper elements. And if we return these non-paper elements to their sources, then there can be no paper at all. As thin as this sheet of paper is, it contains everything in the universe. So paper is made up only of non-paper elements, right? It's made up of particles of wood pulp, for instance, that have been then combined together and pressed, and all the rest of the process that makes it a sheet of paper. My body is made up only of non-body elements. It can be broken down into all the discrete organs and so forth that comprise it. The sun is made up only of non-sun elements, and so on. So paper, body, sun are names for complex phenomena comprised of elements that have other names. So I would say that the Buddha's principal teaching is exactly that all things arise due to causes and conditions. The Sanskrit is pratitya samutpada. It might be said that the Buddha's principal teaching is that all things are impermanent, but of course, if they are impermanent, it means that they are caused, and that means they arise in dependence on certain causes and conditions. So whether you say that impermanence or dependent arising is the principal teaching, I don't really see that there's much of a difference. Anyway, this conclusion is said to arise from the Buddha's Night of Enlightenment. During the first watch, it said, he recalled thousands of his prior births. He saw how his intentional acts of body, speech, and mind, his karma, resulted in one lifetime after another. And in the second watch, he saw how the karma of other beings resulted in their birth as different types and in different places. In the third watch, he saw the chain of causes that he later taught as what he called the links of dependent arising. But the theme of that basically is that it's our intentional actions, our karma of body, speech, and mind that lead to one rebirth after another. And in the fourth watch of the night, he completed his elimination of the poisons of delusion, ill will, and greed, and became completely enlightened. For the rest of his life, he taught that all things, without exception, arise or occur due to causes and conditions. So one of the controversies in Buddhist environmental ethics is whether Praticca Samutpada is only talking about karma and rebirth, but what we're calling eco-dharma now, a kind of modern movement, rises on the broader interpretations of Mahayana Buddhism, that it applies to all causes and conditions and what arises from them, and not just rebirth. So I want to briefly set out three versions of dependent arising. So these are my own labels. So there are traditional Buddhists who rely on early Buddhism, who say what we've been saying here, that all things arise due to causes and conditions. But in Mahayana Buddhism, you go a little deeper, and so-called green Buddhists are depending upon this interpretation. Because all causes of things themselves have causes, and so on, ad infinitum, all other things become implicated in a thing's causes. And finally, there's kind of a special interpretation, not quite so popular, but I think deeply profound, which I'm calling radical non-dualist, based upon the East Asian Huayan school, which in turn is based upon the Indian text, the Avatamsaka Sutra, the Flower Garland Sutra, which describes interdependence as interpenetration. And they say that all apparently distinct things contain, in fact, the whole of existence. So to go back then to dependent arising in early Buddhism, because samsara, the wheel of cyclic existence, is depicted as a fire from which we need to escape, it could be said that the teaching of dependent arising has been seen as indifferent to the fate of worlds or their inhabitants. It's just something to escape from. So some Buddhist scholars have fastened on this aspect of dependent arising to throw cold water on the depiction of Buddhism as an eco-friendly condition. So some people have depended upon texts to do this, and they've pointed to passages in the Pali scriptures that speak of the world in negative terms. But I think they're really distorting what the Buddha was teaching, namely that the problem is not the world itself, it's our attitude towards it. It serves as a basis for delusion, ill will, and greed. If you can eliminate those, then you can live a life on the earth and in interrelation with its inhabitants, as the Buddha did himself for 45 years after his enlightenment. And also overlooks, it seems to me, us being enjoined to develop the virtues of love and compassion and generosity, which points towards, interaction with the beings of this world rather than just escaping from it. So the Pali text, it seems to me, neither value nor devalue the world, but because of the values they teach, about the ethical values they teach, understanding this level of causality also leads in the direction of care for the world and its inhabitants. Other people, such as Bhikkhu Analayo and Chris Ives, both of whom I respect a great deal, object that because dependent arising is portrayed in the Pali scriptures only as an explanation for karma and rebirth, um, the broader interpretations that Mahayana Buddhist schools have taken up might be illegitimate. I'm sorry, I would actually, um, I guess skipped over. I started to read something that I didn't mean to read there based on this. So let me go back. Um, they're saying that if the earth is called mother, or if it's asserted that all things are interdependent, it means that I regard even nuclear waste as my mother, and that's something that I must protect. So one possible reply to this is that, if you recognize the connection, it doesn't necessarily mean that you approve and cherish that sort of, aspect of it. For instance, when I look into my own ancestry, I find that there were slaveholders and other unsavory characters in my family tree. So I can be grateful to them because without them, I wouldn't exist. But at the same time, I can renounce their actions. The point is, when I recognize interdependence, I'm acknowledging the good and the bad and the ugly. I would also point to the fact that when we're developing compassion for others, we're encouraged to reflect on the fact that they have all been our mothers. Of course, these other beings have also been our torturers, our rapists, and so forth. But in the development of compassion, we put that aside and we focus on the positive. So it's okay to call the earth our mother. It's a way of appealing to the emotions to arrive at a greater regard for it. So it's also true that the earth has volcanoes, earthquakes, killer storms, and countless other dangers for us. But we can focus on the positive and use it as a way to develop compassion for others. Okay, so I'm realizing it's already 11:15 here, and I haven't gotten into really the third of these views. So I'll put that off for another time and stop right here. And I think we can have a bit of talk. Okay.